Thanks, Adam. And really great set of presentations. Thank you very much. As always, I start with a declaration that I am a male of the species, and I can only do one thing at a time. So I do my very best to manage a whole series of different lists. Sometimes I get upset, but we'll see how we crack on. I will do my best to keep to chronological order from the list of questions as they're submitted. And I'm going to go back to Neil Robb. He has a question for Tara about the tuna. Neil, do you want to go ahead? You still with us, Neil? Can you unmute?
Neil is still with us, but
he is. Adam, can you unmute Neil?
Oh, I've got.
It's already been allowed.
No, there and there. Okay. Hi. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Neil.
Oh, sorry. Apologies. Okay, thanks. Hi. I'll be polite to the camera as well. Yeah. So, Tara, yeah, you mentioned tuna, the bluefin tuna. I'm curious about that because obviously with the rising sea, the increasing temperature of the sea, bluefin tuna are actually really large, aren't they? And so I'm kind of curious about them. So yeah, so what was my question? Oh, it was a two-part question. So the first one is, do the UK waters have a plan already regarding sustainable fishing specifically for tuna?
Yeah, the context that it was presented there was in a catch and release. Because they're obviously not in a position. There historically was a fishery for bluefin quite a few decades ago off in UK waters, but that ended. So the way tuna are managed, because they're highly migratory, is that they're managed internationally. The UK couldn't manage effectively a transboundary species like tuna. So tuna is managed through these international agencies. You might be familiar with something called ICAT, which is the International Commission on the Conservation of Atlantic Tunas. So there's a huge number of species of tunas. Some of them are highly protected, some of them are sustained fisheries, but their sustainable management is regulated through these international agencies. So that's how sustainable tuna fishing proceeds. But here in the UK, these are just really opportunistic, observations of tuna now. So I don't think we're there, but it could be that there are opportunities for recreational fisheries, catch and release, just like salmon.
Yeah, because it was probably because of the documentary that I saw a while ago, and obviously as just a citizen, not a scientist, my brain is thinking warmer temperatures, migration of fish, and when I heard the first part of information about tuna in our waters, I think in the south of England, I thought, oh, that'd be interesting because then maybe we can save the populations that way as well, given that they're being overfished in other countries.
Yeah.
Maybe we would take a leading role in that. And I thought, oh, that's quite good. So I was curious about that.
Well, you can take a role in it by just demanding sustainably sourced fish in the marketplace. So that's the easiest way to do this, because the consumer has a lot of power, I think, in requiring sustainable traceability in their food products.
I think that you've already answered the second question there anyway, and how long will they be here for?
Thanks, Neil.
Okay. Thanks.
Thanks, Neil. Just doing my one thing at a time bit here. I'm going to call on somebody called Obert. I'm wondering if that's a Robert that's been misspelled.
That's correct.
Yeah, Robert, you had a question for Tara.
Yeah, if the sea temperatures are rising, this is also going to affect not just the sea species, but the marine aquaculture species. So their breeding cycle and size of produced fish, etc., will also presumably be affected. Would that be the case?
Yeah, it certainly would mean changes in their growth responses. Farmed fish are very different beast. In a way, the aquaculture industry has optimized selection so that they optimize this through selective breeding, varieties of fish for specific conditions. So currently they optimize them to delay onset of puberty. And they also are trying to encourage some degree of disease resistance and things like that. So they're quite a different thing, that the aquaculture industry optimizes the variety of fish that they grow for the local conditions. So I think in the way that they would mitigate a response would to be continually to optimize the variety of salmon that are being grown in their farms. That's my guess, how they would deal with that.
Well, thanks very much. I'll still boycott farm salmon.
Yeah.
I have a question for B. B, I enjoy cooking fish, and you said pelagic fish are climate smart, if I can summarize what you said. What do I ask for in the fishmongers if I want climate smart fish?
I think Tara, I'm good with numbers. Tara's better with fish identification generally.
Yeah.
In our double active research. But I think basically pelagic fish are fish that live in the water column. They're generally oily fish, so mackerel, herring. I think that's pretty much the two main commercial ones. But I guess sprats as well, Tara. That's generally the kind of fish that are good, and they really do. They are a climate smart fish, so they perform at the same level as a lot of the kind of farmed vegetable protein sources, so pulses and grains. So from that perspective, and also they generally have a good health benefit too. So by getting people to eat climate smart, we're possibly not only addressing some of the climate emergency issues, but we're also supporting getting a healthy population. And there's, as I said, there's sometimes other benefits in some of these policies that could be identified, and how we build that synergistic policy making is something Tara and I have discussed quite often already.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, Jeff, is that also mussels and oysters are very good. In fact, there's some data that suggests that these are carbon, they have a negative carbon footprint. So Mother Nature is essentially growing them for us, and because they sequester carbon in their shells, they might be have a negative footprint. So you could make a nice bouillabaisse from maybe you know, some appropriately farmed salmon species, some shellfish, and you know, throw in a few, I don't know if oily fish go into bouillabaisse, but you've got options.
Yep. Well, I'll need to educate my dearly beloved as to what we should be switching our diet towards. Just to finish on this, would sardines fall into that category as well?
Yeah.
All right. That's great. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Cornwall is got a very, I think they've got an MSC certified sardine fishery. If you're interested in a local UK, look up the Cornish sardine organization or something like that.
Can I, Jeff, I'll just caveat that with, when looking at the emissions from fuel, if you eat sardines which were caught very far away, then your transport emissions may also be slightly more problematic, I would say. So try to shorten the supply chain as well and eat local.
Yeah, Okay, well, I'm Mr. Goody Two Shoes when it comes to food shopping. I don't buy anything outside Europe and North Africa. Okay, thank you for that. And while we were talking, Neil has quipped, I think we need a colorful image or PDF of climate smart fish. That would be good to educate the general public. I assume that was in only half in jest, Neil. Okay, let's move on. Alison has a question for Bill about salt marshes. Alison, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, hi, Bill. I mean, you did answer it somewhat, but I was just wondering about some really good examples that we could be using to replicate. I know some of the RSPB ones, and obviously there was one in Nig Bay, and yourself, you mentioned one at Grangemouth. Are there any other ones that you think are particularly good that we could learn from, or we should take as examples?
Yeah, it's a good question, Alison. There's so little work done on managed realignment to show the additionality. So the additionality is really what we need to account for in terms of the climate mitigation potential. And this is, of course, what investors are interested in, because this is carbon that wasn't there before. There are potentially management interventions at scale. For example, a change in agricultural practice across the habitats throughout Scotland or throughout England, could actually make a big difference, and could be achieved through, the Brexit-based change in subsidy regime. So those are very interesting. What we've been doing at the moment is looking at some of those sites like RSPB Nig. We've been doing some work there because they're quite well constrained. There's a chrono sequence, there's a timeline of when the managed realignment took place. And what we need to demonstrate, particularly I think for the investment case, is what that additional carbon is. I should say, though, in the grand scheme of things, these are quite small amounts of additional carbon. They're not going to solve, our net zero problems, but they do contribute. And the key thing is that they accumulate over time. So, strong argument for nature-based solutions is start early and let those stores accumulate. Just as carbon has been accumulating in the atmosphere, nature can build up these stores over time. So the sooner we start, the better, really. But
sorry, it has adaptation strengths too, obviously, because then if you allow natural flooding, then you're more resilient around the coast.
Yeah, so we've done a bit of work in England with the Environment Agency, and their interest in a lot of these managed realignment schemes from sea level rise is for coastal flooding. And so the habitat creation is an additional benefit, and the blue carbon is something that they're very interested in because it might help with the funding and push some of these projects kind of over the line, as it were. So it needs to be, I think, going back to that language of a whole range of services that flow, and carbon is simply one of those benefits that we can get from some of these schemes. But again, they're climate smart systems. They can help us adapt to future sea level rise, so they are important.
Okay, Bill, thanks for that. We're getting into the part of the questions where you get most of them, because we collected the questions as you were speaking. So I have a question to you from Bob Pringle regarding MPAs. Bob, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, Bill, you say that MPAs are very heavily protected, but I think they allow trawling on about 5%. Well, they disallow trawling on about 5%. Is this because the fishing industry would go bananas if they had more?
Thanks, Bob. I'm not quite sure that I said that. We do have a marine protected area networks. Many of those MPAs are not, they don't preclude fishing, but there is a commitment from government that was made last year. And this is also something that's coming across the UK, a commitment to what they call highly protected marine areas, so HPMAs. And my understanding of these HPMAs is that they will move towards, a removal of some of these pressures and potentially closure of these areas. Now, of course, that creates all sorts of management challenges. Fishers will perhaps shift their effort elsewhere if you close one area. So, designing these in the best way will be quite challenging, but it's an exciting time. But, they will be designed to protect these areas and to allow for recovery of the marine ecosystem. And I think this is where the carbon comes in, because, we could get biodiversity gains, but we could also get some climate mitigation, climate benefits. But we don't fully understand the scale of those benefits yet. And so this is, I think, where some of these arguments, are contested, and I think quite rightly contested. We have a fishing industry, we want to support them. People's livelihoods are at stake. So we want to get the evidence right to optimize the gains for, as I said, in that paper, it's for climate, it's for people, and for nature, and there is a way to do this, I think, but it's going to be challenging. I'll leave that to Bea and her colleagues.
Thanks.
Okay, Bob, you happy with that? We'll move on. We're collecting some more questions as we go, which is great. Thank you very much. Pete Ritchie, you had a question for William about Lulu CF, whoever she is. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, William, I'm sorry if I missed this in your presentation, which I thought was brilliant. And I mean, it's so keen to see more on blue carbon in the next climate change plan, because it felt like there's a big opportunity here. And I hadn't realized about the inventory and what's in and what's out. So that was really helpful. But it's just that we got this sort of nasty shock a couple of years ago on the peatlands, finding that, they were actually losing carbon at an astonishing rate. We had to revise the land use figures upwards because of that. And I'm just wondering if you could say any more about the sort of the flow. We know you said a lot about the stocks, but do we know if we're losing blue carbon at the moment, or if we're gaining it, or where we are on that?
Yeah, Pete, that's a great question and grateful comment as well. And I think we should commend Scottish Government for supporting this area. There's been a commitment for this since 2018. There's a lot of work to do still. We don't have all the answers. We have, though, historically, for that salt marsh coastal wetland habitat across the UK, we've probably lost up to 80% of that habitat through land reclamation. It's been very attractive over a number of centuries to reclaim this land from the sea. So I think with rising sea levels, we have a chance to rethink maybe regaining some of those habitats. That was partly what I was showing. The other thing I think to say is that, if we manage nature in the best possible way, it will function in a way that's good for biodiversity and for carbon. And I think we saw that with our peatlands. Our peatlands are, very degraded. And I think, what's happened with the land use change aspect of peatlands is that we can now, by investing in the re-wetting, so, blocking up the drainage ditches, allowing the restoration of those peatlands, we'll quickly see them switch from net emitters to net carbon sinks. And this is very exciting because it shows us that by restoring nature, we can actually get gains for climate, as well as all of the other, biodiversity benefits for those peatlands. And it creates jobs. You know, there is a green recovery opportunity in rethinking the way we work with nature, and you can create jobs. People want to visit these places. I think salt marshes are great because they give us a taste of our coastal fringe, and they help people understand, you know, the benefits of restoring coastal environments. So yeah, I mean, the jury's out on what the, you know, if we bring salt marsh into the inventory, my feeling is that it's a small, pretty small net sink at the moment. But we may need to look carefully at the way we're managing some of those habitats to optimize their sink potential. And of course, you know, what we don't want to do is lose the stored carbon, because they hold a lot of carbon.
Thank you. That was really helpful, William. Thank you.
Okay, Pete, thanks for that question. I'm going to go to Richard. All I have on the label is just Richard. You had a question for Bill about sedimentary carbon stores.
That's right. Yeah, I was very struck by your map you had of the organic carbon stores, which certainly within the coastal areas showed that the highest densities of carbon were in the Minch and the Clyde. And it just so happened that these coincided with some of the highest swept areas from trawling. So you've got the highest density of organic carbon and the highest amount of trawling going on there, which means that you're putting these carbon stores at risk, because any bottom contact fishing gear is going to be disrupting the carbon stores. And I wondered if you'd done any economic costing of what this was costing in terms of losing stored carbon. I was very struck. There's about in 2015 or 2014, I think it was, the Scottish Government commissioned a study of inshore fishing and options for changing it, an economic study by Riddington and Radford, which concluded that Scotland would be economically far better off by banning trawling and mobile fishing gears within about 3 miles of the coast. Now, that didn't include any assessment of the impacts on stored organic carbon. And it struck me that if one were to cost in the benefits from preserving stored carbon, it would hugely tip the economic benefits in favour of a complete trawl ban within most of the inshore waters around Scotland, which of course would then supersede any of the arguments about highly protected marine protected areas.
Well, Richard, I appreciate your question. There are some challenges with some of the science still. I think your point about the economics are interesting. And I think where this is most interesting is to think about the potential, particularly in inshore waters, for more sustainable alternatives. We should, I think, look to see, you know, if there are sustainable alternatives that might reduce the pressure. But in terms of those pressures, the work at the moment is really trying to drive a better understanding of what that does to those carbon stores. Now, you're right to say that these are very rich, they're high density organic carbon stores in these coastal waters. And, you know, there's a reason why people fish there, because they're highly productive. So, you know, there is a sort of collision of the pressure and the store of carbon in these places. They're also part of a sort of dynamic system where carbon moves through our shelf seas, you know, so there are natural processes that we need to think about here as well as those sort of anthropogenic human pressures. And the other thing that we're really trying to grapple with at the moment is the nature of the carbon and its vulnerability to disturbance. Because we think that as we move across coastal areas and our shelf seas, that the carbon may be in a more vulnerable state in some places than it is in others. And we really need to improve that spatial mapping to make the best informed decisions. As I say, you know, one of the difficulties at the moment is to understand quite how much trawling disturbs and releases carbon. And those sort of estimates, particularly estimates of greenhouse gas emissions from those pressures, are not well understood. So if you were having a conversation with the minister, you know, one of the challenges would be, you know, to quantify the actual emissions from this disturbance. But you're right, you know, there are pressure points, and it's very clear from our mapping. So those sediment maps are from our work, and those fishing pressure maps are well established and published and so on. In inshore waters, I think the other challenge, and I'm sure you know this, is that we don't monitor the inshore small vessel fleets probably as well as we would like. So we don't completely understand where all those pressures are. But I think this inshore water is of interest, and it is an area where I think we probably do need to focus a little bit more on this sort of economic aspects. And that's, I would imagine, one of the directions of travel for the work of our Scottish Blue Carbon Forum in the next 12 months or so. I would be very surprised if we're not trying to, you know, make some of those calculations. I agree with you. I think it would be very useful to understand the economics of this alongside you know, the climate implications of it as the evidence improves. We do need to find alternatives. You know, I think a complete ban is probably not the right way forward. You know, there's people's livelihoods and so on at stake here. So we need to find alternative sustainable futures. That's my personal view.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
I'm just going to do a brief time check. It's 20 to the hour. We will finish at the top of the hour, absolutely. I'm going to do my very best to get through the remaining questions, and my apologies in advance if we don't achieve it. So I'm going to call on David Fisher. You have a question for B about fishing and fuel use.
Yeah, so if I understood your life cycle analysis correctly, 96% of the carbon is due to fuel, and so the remaining 4% is construction and blah blah blah. So does that mean that all our efforts and our investment into decarbonising this industry should be in improving engine efficiency, redesigning hulls, changing boat kind of navigation and so on too, and what potential is there to do that kind of thing? So someone mentioned converting outboards to use hydrogen. I mean, can we like use other energy reclaiming technologies we can use while the boats are in the sea? Like what is our wiggle room here to actually get that, improve the efficiency, so get that 96% way down?
So that's a very interesting question, David. Thank you very much. I think, to my mind, it's not as simple as only changing one of the components. So fuel use is a very big part, but obviously by changing ship design or making efficiencies in the gear types, or maybe reducing gear drag, then that is only minor. Some of the other changes that will be needed across vessels in general, not just fishing vessels, is around propulsion. And that is really going to be different for different kinds of vessels. And if we think about how diverse even the Scottish fishing fleet is, then you can imagine that for some vessels, that's very easy to do because they maybe have a limit on their operations that they're only out for the day and they can recharge at port in the evening. But for other vessels, that could be much more complex. And so there is innovation happening already on novel fuels. And for instance, I think in Norway, there's a trawler, which is a LNG hybrid electric vessel, which actually liquid natural gas has lower emissions related to it already, but then the added benefit is that it could be retrofitted for ammonia cells in due course once that technology is established. And I guess part of, I think someone asked further down on what are the key things, it's kind of supporting that innovation with the right investment probably, and how you do that as a government in terms of underwriting and those kind of things. That's not my speciality, I would say. But so there's a lot to do in terms of trying to identify which types of innovations will suit which parts of the sector as well the best, and how we can then help them to achieve that, and how I think there's a role both for government in terms of how they incentivize that. Maybe there's a role for the market, so how shipbuilders start bringing their innovation to market, and then enabling the fishing sector to do that kind of uptake of those new innovations, I would say. So it's a very fast moving field now, I think, in terms of the kind of vessel innovation. And part of the other side of the question is then how we need to innovate our harbor side infrastructure. So ports and fuel bunkering will also, there's added, it's a piece across, I think, a variety of sectors to consider.
Cool,
Indeed, I think that's a great answer. Sorry, David, I cut across you.
No, just saying thank you. Yep, all good.
Yeah, it might seem very straightforward to fix the fishing fleet, but it's not just the boats, it's the whole supply chain. Thanks for that, B. Tara, we have a question for you from John M about fish size. John, are you still with us?
Yes, it was. Tara actually answered it in the chat.
So you're happy with
that? From my understanding, fish like cod, etc., produce so many eggs per kilogram body weight. So if they're growing more slowly, I just asked if that correlation still held good. If the fish were smaller, did they still produce less eggs because they were smaller? It wasn't related in any way to the age of the stock. That was kind of like that.
Yeah. My answer, well, first of all, I complimented John on his question because he's really thinking like a biologist there. And big fish are disproportionately more fecund. They produce a higher number of eggs per gram of female fish. So if you lose large individuals, you disproportionately lose eggs that are produced in a given spawning season. So it translates directly into loss in productivity. Absolutely. And that's why the management system would have to change to accommodate lower levels of productivity. So yeah, congratulations again on to John.
I think related to that, some other inquiry would be, because those fish, many of the species lay their eggs at a certain temperature in the water column. So with the change in currents within the North Sea and the change in areas high stocking, does that mean that a lot of the nursery areas are no longer the optimal nursery areas that the fish are ending up in because their eggs are being laid in a different depth of water?
Yeah, could be. Complicated question.
Okay.
I would say that it relates to that thermal tolerance. So they'll probably just more likely to have unsuccessful reproduction because of the narrow. There's a lot of reasons bundled together, including possibly spawning area.
Yep, and the surface chop, etc., that's associated with the climate change storms. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll sign off.
Appreciate that, John. Thank you. I'm going to move to Adam. You have a question for Tara and or B. Go ahead, Adam.
I can't remember what. Yeah, my question. It's related to that fact that British people don't eat British fish. So that is a fact we're being told about a lot. But how will climate change impact that? change that story, and how do we address it? Do we need to address it?
Well, you know, we export a lot of fish that we don't eat, and we import a lot of fish that we do eat, because we have such a preference for cod, prawns, salmon, and tuna. And so I think we export 80% of our fish and import 80% of the fish that we consume. So it's completely out of whack. So a simple answer would be, yes, we do have to eat sustainably. We do have to eat locally. And Scotland produces amazing sea fish. It's expensive though. And it's more likely that, say, European markets would pay, you know, the high costs of some of our shellfish or whatever. So it's not an easy problem to tackle, consumer preferences. There's a lot of marketing. Seafish does a lot of marketing trying to encourage this. And of course, the health benefits of eating, say, pelagic fish are very much promoted, but there's only so much you can do with consumer preferences. Bea, do you have anything to add to that?
So I think the other component is that these fish have an important role in food security, and so we do export a lot of our pelagic fish, but they do go to feed some of the poorer countries and poorer people as well. So I think someone at Marine Scotland mentioned to me that a lot of mackerel is actually exported to Africa, and so they have a role in the kind of global, how do you feed the global population as well. That's worth keeping in mind. In terms of how we get people to eat more sustainably caught fish or climate smart foods, I think that's a wider kind of thing, which I know other colleagues in policy departments have struggled with in terms of what the role is for government to say what people should do. But then at the same time, I think increasingly people are becoming aware of their food green, you know, their food carbon footprint. And so as I think the population becomes a little bit more educated, hopefully that shift may come quite naturally. And that's maybe where retail also has a role to play. I know some of the big retailers have been thinking about putting carbon footprints on their packaging. So that could be another incentive for people to think about whether they buy a lobster or a herring, if that makes sense.
Yep, I appreciate that, Bea. Thank you. Moving right on, I'm going to call on Joshua. He has a question for you, Bea. I know you've already covered fuel being a really big deal, but Joshua has a broader question on decarbonisation. Do you want to go ahead, Joshua?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. Really good talk. I just wanted to try to get Bea to kind of boil it down into, you know, what are the 2 to 3 kind of main challenges? I mean, you covered fuel, and that's kind of 96% of the emissions. So is it just fuel, or is it, if I asked you for the 3 main challenges for the decarbonisation of the Scottish fishing fleet, kind of what would you say?
It's a tricky one. I think so. Part of what I hopefully also kind of highlighted is that understanding the processes that have bigger greenhouse gas emissions is a complex question that requires a lot of information, and getting that information in the right form to the right people is also quite critical. So I think there's really more to be done. I think the other thing is we have this detailed analysis of the pelagic fleet, which we know is very efficient. I think there was a comment about, you know, they're big boats that go out, catch a lot of fish in a very small amount of effort, so days at sea. There are other fleet segments that have a lot of effort, catch relatively less fish, but actually catch much greater value fish. So they're very valuable fisheries as well to us. And so there's this question of, do they actually behave the same? Does that 96% translate across the entire Scottish fishing sector? And that's one question that I think is still a big challenge for us. And then the other one, I think I'm just going to boil it to two, which is what I've also already touched on, is that to decarbonize the fleet is not just telling someone to change their boat. There's a lot of kind of, the market around shipbuilding, the infrastructure. It's a very complex landscape. And so I think it's building partnerships between scientists, industry, government to try and address some of those interventions that will really get us there, I think.
Yeah, B, thank you for that. The more we dig into this particular topic, the more interesting it gets. So at the risk of going over it, I've got a question from John McDonald. He's trying to kill two birds with one stone here, using the pelagic fisheries as a main target. John, do you want to go ahead?
I think probably B answered the question with our last question. I mean, I know that the pelagic boats are so successful that in terms of fish target, and mackerel is now such a numerous or such a big part of the catch, and they are maybe benefiting as other species are beginning to crash. So
yeah,
it's exactly what you said. Exactly what you said.
I think sorry to talk across you, but I think one addition is that they're very technologically advanced, and so they are a fleet which really has tools to make sure that they can target their effort in the right way, and that's maybe around those future interventions something that we can investigate more as well.
I think the issue maybe with them is the social side of things, because they are a very small employer in terms of that, in terms of the social benefit in terms of sustainability from the pelagic fishery, I suppose, is mainly at the processing end to some extent. But I won't linger on that. Thanks for your answer. That was great.
Thank you for the question.
And thank you, John. Now it is 5 to 9. So I want to thank the three speakers for answering all these challenging questions. I think you did great. And thanks to our audience for supplying such challenging questions. I'm going to add my thanks and then hand back to Adam for final remarks. Thank you, Adam.